The first huge one, which really defines the Austrian critique of government, is the economic calculation problem.
This is Mises' intellectual sledgehammer against socialism. He developed it in an essay in 1920, and his argument wasn't just moral or political. He argued that it was logically and economically impossible to run a modern economy without market prices.
And the core problem wasn't a lack of resources, but a lack of information, a failure of price discovery.
Exactly. In a socialist system, the state owns all the means of production. So capital goods, the machines, the raw materials, the factories, they're not actually traded between independent owners.
They're just internal transfers.
Right. If the state moves steel from the state-owned mill to the state-owned tractor factory, there's no real transaction.
No sale, no price.
Correct. They aren't objects of exchange. And without true market prices for those capital goods, the central planners have no way of knowing if they're allocating resources rationally.
So the planner has no way of calculating the opportunity cost. If they use steel to build a bridge, they can't know if society would have valued, say, a new train system or more medical equipment more highly.
The information just isn't there. Mises argued that this process of economic calculation, rationally comparing costs and benefits, is impossible in a socialist commonwealth. Resources would just inevitably be wasted because the planners are essentially flying blind.
And then his student, Friedrich Hayek, he took this idea and expanded it with what's called the Hayekian insight. He focused on the knowledge problem.
Yeah, Hayek's contribution was brilliant. He shifted the focus from just the lack of prices to the total lack of information aggregation. Hayek said the information needed to run an economy, local demands, resource availability, new technologies. It's dispersed. It's tacit. It's only known locally by millions of different people.
Like a jigsaw puzzle with a million pieces scattered all over the world.
That's a great analogy. And the market price is the only mechanism capable of instantly pulling all that fragmented subjective knowledge together into a single usable signal.
So if the price of copper suddenly jumps,
entrepreneurs all over the world immediately know they need to economize on copper. And they don't even need to know why the price went up. They don't need to know if it was a mine strike in Chile or a new manufacturing discovery in Japan. The price tells them everything they need to know to act rationally.
And central planners, by definition, can never have all that local, constantly changing knowledge.
Never. They're epistemologically trapped. It's why, as the sources note, inefficiency is a necessary outcome. And this whole debate was a huge part of the intellectual case against centrally planned economies.
So if the calculation problem attacked central planning, the Austrian business cycle theory, or ADCT, it really goes after central banking.
It does. This theory is in fundamental disagreement with how pretty much all major world governments try to manage their economies today.
So what's the core idea?
ABCT argues that economic cycles, the booms and the busts, they aren't natural features of a market economy. They're actually caused by interference in the money and credit system, primarily by central banks manipulating interest rates.
Okay, so let's walk through the boom phase. How does it get started?
It all begins when a central bank, or the fractional reserve banking system, pushes interest rates down below the natural rate.
The natural rate being what the rate would be if it were just set by people's actual savings decisions.
Precisely. They're voluntary time preferences. The interest rate is a price signal. It's the price of time and capital. And when you artificially lower that price, you send a false signal out to the entire market.
What's the false signal?
The signal is that there's a much bigger pool of real savings available to fund long-term investment than actually exists. So entrepreneurs, they see this cheap money and they start investing heavily in these long-term, capital-intensive projects.
And this expansion of the capital structure has a specific name, right? Roundaboutness.
Roundaboutness. It's the process of taking raw materials through multiple long stages of production to get to a final consumer good. The lower the interest rate, the more roundabout the production processes entrepreneurs are willing to fund.
So could you give us an analogy for this, for roundaboutness and what they call malinvestment?
Sure. Think of it like this. If interest rates reflected real savings, builders might only start projects they know they can finish, like standard 2-year apartment complexes. But when the central bank makes credit artificially cheap, it signals that patient capital is abundant.
So they get more ambitious.
Way more ambitious. Suddenly, they're tearing down the viable apartment projects to start building, massive 100-story skyscrapers that will take 10 years to complete. Or speculative new factories for products that don't exist yet.
And those long-term, super ambitious projects Those are the malinvestment.
Exactly. Malinvestment is the misallocation of real resources, labor, steel, concrete, into these unsustainable projects. They only look profitable because of that artificially cheap interest rate signal. The actual savings needed to see that 10-year skyscraper through to the end. It just isn't there.
So the whole boom is running on fumes. It's credit that isn't backed by actual real savings.
Right. And eventually the market has to correct. Consumers, who never actually changed their real saving habits, keep spending on consumption goods. This drives up the prices of labor and resources, which starts squeezing the profits of those long-term projects.
They start to realize their costs are way higher than they planned.
And they can't get the capital to finish. That's the bust. The projects are revealed to be unsustainable and have to be liquidated.
So the boom itself created the seeds of its own destruction.
It did. The summary of ABCT is perfect. Monetary factors cause the cycle, but real phenomena constitute it. The central bank's policy is the trigger, but the pain of the bust is the very real process of correcting all those mistakes.
Which is why the Austrian prescription is so different. They'd say Keynesian stimulus during a bust just makes it worse.
Because it props up the malinvestments and prevents the necessary healthy correction from happening.
I want to spend a second on this because it causes so much confusion. The specific Austrian view of inflation.
Ah, yes. The terminology quirk. Mises was incredibly strict about this. For him, inflation is defined as, and only as, an increase in the quantity of money.
Full stop. Not rising prices.
Not rising prices. An increase in the money supply, including what he called fiduciary media, that isn't matched by an increase in the demand for money. That's it.
This is a huge break from how we talk about it today. I mean, everyone from the news anchor to the Fed chair defines inflation as rising prices, the CPI.
I know. But for Mises, rising prices were the consequence of inflation. They were the symptom, not the disease.
So if inflation is the money supply increase, what did he call the rising prices?
He just called it the result. He argued that if policymakers are only focused on controlling the symptom, the rising prices, while at the same time continuing the cause, increasing the money supply, they can never actually solve the problem.
It's like treating a fever with an ice pack while ignoring the infection that's causing it.
Perfect analogy. And this framing completely shifts who's responsible. If the central bank increases the money supply by 10%, that is inflation, even if consumer prices don't move for a year, the price changes might show up in assets first, like housing or the stock market.
And Hayek added a really important warning here, didn't he? About using inflation to boost employment.
He did. He said that any stimulus from inflation only works as long as it accelerates. He argued that trying to maintain just a mild, steady inflation rate eventually stops working because people start to expect it and they adjust their wage and price demands accordingly.
So you have to keep printing more and more money, faster and faster, just to get the same effect.
And that, he argued, leads down a very dangerous path.
As the school became more visible in the mid-20th century, it kind of fractured. Let's talk about the big split between the Mises-Rothbard camp and the Hayek camp.
Right. The split wasn't really over the core foundations like individualism or subjectivity. It was more about how rigid the methodology should be and what political conclusions you should draw from the economics.
So how did the Mises-Rothbard camp define itself?
That camp, which is heavily associated with the Mises Institute today, really embraces the most hardcore, rigorous form of praxeology.
The purely deductive method.
Yes. They basically view any neoclassical methodology, so empirical testing, mathematical models, as fundamentally flawed. And they went a step further and fused this rigid method with a very strong libertarian political theory, often advocating for anarcho-capitalism or a tiny, minimal state.
So for them, the economics and the politics were inseparable.
You could say that. They saw political individualism as a logical requirement of sound economic thought.
Okay, and what about the Hayek camp? I mean, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974, which gave the whole school a huge boost in visibility.
Hayek's view was, well, more moderate, more pragmatic. It's often associated with places like George Mason University. While Hayek was completely on board with the knowledge problem and decentralization, he was more open to some aspects of neoclassical methodology.
And less absolute in his rejection of government intervention.
Exactly. He saw Austrian economics more as a powerful tool for analysis, not something that was necessarily fused to one specific maximalist libertarian political outcome.
And the sources bring up a really interesting historical point here. They challenged that Mises-Rothbard rigidity by pointing back to the founder, Menger.
This is a crucial bit of nuance. Critics point out that Menger himself actually defended some broader state activity, like progressive taxation and labor laws.
So if you apply the rigid political test that some modern Austrians use to exclude Hayek,
Yeah.
you might end up excluding the school's own founder, Karl Menger. It raises a really interesting question. Is Austrian economics a purely scientific method, or is it an inseparable political philosophy?
That debate is still going on. But regardless of the internal fights, the school has had a profound, undeniable influence on money policy. We have that famous quote from Alan Greenspan.
Yeah, the former Fed chair.
Yeah.
Greenspan, who was definitely a mainstream guy, said that the Austrian founders have had a profound and, in my judgment, probably an irreversible effect on how most mainstream economists think in this country. So even if the world hasn't adopted the whole Austrian business cycle theory, the core ideas have seeped in.
Absolutely. Concepts like time preference, opportunity cost, and especially the idea that knowledge is dispersed, those have been absorbed into global macroeconomic thinking. They might not use the language of praxeology.
But they can't just ignore the knowledge problem or the structural issues caused by messing with interest rates anymore.
Exactly. The focus on how money affects the structure of production, not just the overall price level, has forced a much better, more critical analysis from everyone.
Which brings us to the ultimate modern battleground for these ideas, the cryptocurrency connection. The alignment here feels almost perfect.
It's uncanny, isn't it? The
Oh.
principles behind crypto, especially Bitcoin, are like a textbook of Austrian thought.
Decentralization, individual sovereignty, and above all, sound money.
Right. They are a direct response to the Austrian critiques of central banking and fiat currency manipulation. Proponents often argue that Hayek, who wanted competition in currencies, would have loved Bitcoin. They see it as a Hayekian escape from the central bank's monopoly.
So how does that work in practice? How does Bitcoin align with the Austrian definition of inflation?
Well, it's simple. Bitcoin has a fixed, mathematically verifiable supply cap of 21 million units. That's it. This design makes inflation, as Mises defined it, an increase in the money supply, impossible.
The idea being that if you eliminate that monetary cause of instability, you protect the real economy from the booms and busts that follow.
That's the theory. And the source material has that great historical comparison with the ray stones of Yap.
Right, the giant stone money.
Yeah, the ray stones worked as sound money because they were huge and really hard to make or move, so you couldn't easily base the currency. But then 19th century colonists showed up with modern tools and could suddenly bring in tons of new stones.
They inflated the supply.
They inflated the supply and destroyed the currency's value. Bitcoin's algorithmic hard cap is designed specifically to prevent that kind of human or political temptation.
But the sources also point out a really fascinating internal conflict here, a theoretical challenge that Bitcoin presents to strict Austrian theory, the regression theorem.
This is a big one. So Mises's regression theorem states that for something to become money, it has to have originated as a commodity that had a prior non-monetary use value.
Like gold or silver. They were used for jewelry and industry before they were ever used as money. That prior use gave them an initial market value and trust.
Exactly. But Bitcoin, it was created out of thin air, purely as a digital mechanism for exchange. It had no prior use value as a commodity.
So it seemed to violate the theorem.
It creates a real theoretical puzzle for strict Misesian thinkers. Bitcoin seems to prove that the regression theorem, while historically descriptive, might not be a necessary condition. It shows that pure digital scarcity, backed by cryptographic trust, might be enough on its own.
So how are modern Austrians dealing with this?
It's an ongoing debate. Some are synthesizing it. They'll argue that maybe the prior use value can be reinterpreted for the digital age. Perhaps the immediate utility of the network itself, the ability to send value across borders without permission, serves as that initial non-monetary use.
So the use value isn't a physical property like shininess, but the service the network provides.
Exactly. It shifts the definition. But regardless of how that theoretical knot gets untied, it's clear the Austrian school provides the intellectual scaffolding for why technologies like Bitcoin were even invented. They're a direct answer to the problems the Austrians identified a century ago.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today. We've gone from the origins of the Austrian school to its intense focus on the subjective choices of the individual.
All the way to its powerful critiques of central planning with the economic calculation problem.
And its controversial theory of business cycles, which really shines a light on how small distortions in the price of capital can lead to massive, real-world misallocations of resources.
Yeah, and even though it's often seen as heterodox, that Austrian emphasis on time, on decentralized knowledge, and on the absolute importance of sound money, it continues to shape modern debates.
It provides the foundation for so many of the movements pushing for economic liberty and self-sovereignty in this new digital world.
It really forces you to question the big aggregate numbers and statistics, and instead to focus on the choices of billions of individuals and the need for stable, predictable rules of the game, especially when it comes to money.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, based on this whole unique framework. If you accept the Austrian definition of inflation, that it's purely the increase in the money supply and not the rising prices themselves, how does that shift your personal perspective on who is responsible?
Right. When you see prices going up at the grocery store, do you focus on the symptom? Or do you now look for the initial action, the expansion of money and credit that might have happened long before that price tag ever changed?
Something to think about as you navigate the economic news. That's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
We all know the image, right? It's arguably one of the most famous torture scenes in, well, all of Western literature and myth.
Oh, absolutely.
That unforgiving, jagged rock way up in the mountains, the heavy chains biting into immortal flesh, and that terrifying, relentless eagle.
Zeus's personal enforcer.
Exactly, tearing into a liver that just regenerates every night, making sure that agony is always fresh for the morning.
It is the ultimate statement of divine, tyrannical power meeting this unwavering heroic defiance. It's the original clash between oppressive authority and the restless spirit of ingenuity.
Absolutely.